is failing, and the United States has been losing the war on drugs for years. In 1980, about 500,000 people were arrested on drug charges. That number climbed to more than 1.5 million. In the 70s, 1 out of 100,000 deaths were due to overdoses. That statistic skyrocketed to 12 out of 100,000 just by 2008. The world as we know it is getting worse. Therefore, Sidney and I affirm resolve. The United States federal government should legalize all illicit drugs. Contention 1, safe products. First, remember that in the status quo, drug overdoses are only rising each year. Prohibition causes this for a multitude of reasons. Dirty needles, no quality control, and scarce safe treatment options. NPR tells us that recently many people have been consuming fentanyl unbeknownst to them. In 2020, opioid deaths rose 55%, and meth and other stimulants rose by 46%, both linked to drugs being laced. Regulation comes with legalizing drugs. That is not new. And regulations make for a safer market. Current progress in certain states has negatively affected the cartel, the biggest provider of dangerous drugs for the U.S. Compoint in 2018 tells us the rapid spread of legal marijuana across the U.S. is displacing pot smuggled into the country by Mexican drug cartels. Seizures of illegal marijuana shipments at the border suggest changes in states' laws are hitting them hard. In fact, in Colorado, the Cato Institute 2018 reports marijuana legally grown in states where it is legalized often supplies consumers in states where marijuana is still outlawed. In 2014, 44% of marijuana sales in Denver were to residents of other states. This evidence proves that the U.S.-grown marijuana is preferred over marijuana supplied by the cartels. We can infer that the same would happen with other drugs. This ensures quality control, similar to how marijuana can only be legally bought in dispensaries in states like Illinois and Michigan. A safer market destroys the death rate for laced drugs. Contention 2, revenue and debt. The Open Society Foundation reports in 2021 that the war on drugs cost $100 billion annually. A unique advantage to fully legalizing drugs is the tax revenue states will receive from it. Jeffrey Myron, professor of economics at Harvard and senior fellow with the Cato Institute, found that drug legalization could generate up to $106.7 billion in annual budgetary gains for federal, state, and local governments. Those gains would come from two primary sources. One being decreases in drug enforcement spending, and two, increases in tax revenue. This has two impacts, the first being rehabilitation. This revenue that I just spoke about can be poured back into rehabilitation efforts to help those who are illy addicted. In fact, this is already coming to fruition in states that have taken a step in the right direction. Oregon is a key example. An article from U.S. News in 2020 explains some tax revenue from recreational marijuana sales, which exceeded $100 million just in 2019, will go to addiction and recovery services. Furthermore, Oregon will now divert some of the money previously used on drug enforcement to pay for about a dozen new drug prevention and treatment centers statewide, which has been found to be a significantly more cost-effective strategy. This proves that empirically, money gained has been funneled directly back into rehabilitation programs. The second impact is debt relief. This added revenue solves portions of our national debt problem. Foster from the Heritage Foundation in 2013 reports that our current trajectory levels leaves less money available for other priorities, such as national security and economic security, education, and innovation-driving research. Consumers front this cost directly. USA Today in 2018 tells us that the average income for a family of four will drop by $16,000. Overall, the United States is losing the war on drugs. It is time to move forward and help our country out of the hole it has dug itself in. Thus, we affirm.
Everyone to be okay? Opponents ready? Yep. Judges ready? Kate ready? Yep. I'm going to start my time now. Kate and I negate the resolution the United States federal government should legalize all illicit drugs. Our first contention is Big Pharma. Lopez 17 finds that when illicit drugs are legalized, large pharmaceutical companies find an opportunity to sell these once illegal substances and profit off of addiction. They benefit from a culture of legalization in three ways: advertising, marketing to physicians, and off-label marketing. Subpoint A is advertising. Even without widespread legalization, Big Pharma runs rampant. Bulik 21 found that total Big Pharma advertising spending topped $6.6 billion in 2020, and it paid year, Americans spent $350 billion in prescription drugs by McCulloch 22. Money spent on ads has a direct effect, as Lamaze 21 found that for every dollar spent on advertising to consumers, sales of prescription drugs rose $4.40. The same author writes that 2/3 of adults take some kind of action after seeing a drug ad, which is extremely dangerous because the majority of these ads were found to be misleading and threaten public health. Subpoint B is marketing to physicians. Lamaze 21 writes that Big Pharma employs a wide variety of techniques to reach doctors, such as free meals, speaking fees, and sponsoring educational courses and clinical trials. ProPublica in 2016 found that doctors who received industry payments were 2 to 3 times as likely to prescribe brand-name drugs at exceptionally high rates as others in their specialty. Subpoint C is off-label marketing. Lamaze 21 defines off-label marketing as the marketing of a drug to doctors for a use not approved by the FDA. Pharma companies are quick to exploit off-label uses to increase profits, often at the expense of patient safety. Lamaze 21 reports that of the top 5 drugs prescribed off-label by Big Pharma, about 80% did not have strong scientific evidence for off-label use. This study, which looked at 151,000 prescriptions, found that 7.6% of patients suffered adverse effects from the drug, but when the same drug was used off-label, the rate of side effects was 44% greater. The impact to all of these subpoints is increased use and death. To truly estimate how this would manifest in an app world, we must look to past examples of increased legalization. Rebuttal 17 writes that in the opioid crisis, the FDA's misguided approval and branding of opioid medication was due to manipulation by pharmaceutical companies. Due to this, the FDA promoted the idea that opioids are beneficial in managing chronic pain and continued to prescribe it. Derek and Carroll 13 write that as legalization of opioids for medical use increased, so did addiction rates. Avoiding increased use of illicit drugs is crucial. The CDC in 2021 found that from 1999 to 2019, 500,000 people died from an overdose involving any opioid. Critically, the CDC attributes the prescribing of opioids to the increased use. Allowing Big Pharma to promote more dangerous drugs will only amplify the damage from the opioid crisis. Our second contention is drug cartels. Due to recent diversification of drug cartels, legalization will not remove their threat and influence and would worsen it by year 16. The same author writes that this is because loss of inventory is built into the cartel's business model, allowing them to adjust to legalization. Illegal markets will simply move more underground to sell and distribute drugs for a lower cost than the legal ones. The American Enterprise Institute 21 reports that after increased legalization of marijuana, Mexico's violent drug cartels turned to the law of supply and demand, switching to selling opium poppies, which are more harmful than previously sold marijuana. Further, some cartels will move away from illegal drug production, but instead pivot to violence. Simply legalizing the illicit activities of these cartels does not erase these cartels' drive for crime. Dickinson 11 finds that legalizing drugs just moves Mexican cartels to mafia violence. The American Enterprise Institute 21 writes that laws that legalize marijuana have caused a shift in Mexican drug markets, pushing them to violence. They specifically attribute this post-legalization shift to Mexico hitting a record 30,000 murders in 2017. Moving cartels out of the drug industry will have severe consequences and increased violence. In this round, the status quo should be hugely preferred to a world of drug legalization, as the legalization of every illicit drug will only lead to more addiction and death. Thank you. Do you want to do cross sitting here? Or do you want to Is that all right with you guys?
Yes.
Okay, I'm ready when you are.
Is that all right?
Go for it.
All right. So on your subpoint C of off-label market, you bring up towards the end from 1999 to 2019, 500,000 people have died. How many of those were due to prescribed opioids?
Right. So what we're telling you there is that this is people dying from overdoses involving opioids, and the CDC is reporting this. That this is specifically because of the prescribing of opioids. Remember here that opioids are a legal medication that the Big Pharma was prescribing to people. So this is this is a direct result of Big Pharma's advertising increased legalization was the reason for this by the CDC. I have a question on this idea of opioids. So you talk about this increase in treatment that can happen. My question is basically just that opioids are legal drugs right now. So what does treatment for opioids look like?
Okay, so as of right now in the status quo, obviously the generalities, rehabilitation and treatment is ineffective, and that is one of two reasons as to why people don't go right now. So regardless of what opioid treatment looks like in any drug sense, over and across the board, they're ineffective.
Okay, sure, but why are we seeing increased treatment of a legal drug like opioids?
Right, because people are getting cut off from their prescriptions, and they're turning to the illegal market, which is why so many people are dying, and also why they can't get off of it. And people don't want to go to rehab because, as I've said, it's ineffective. But once you gain that revenue, empirically we see, not only does it go to that, but it creates new avenues for people and better treatment options.
Okay, quick question. On your cartels, you talk about those 30,000 murders. That was due to violence, correct?
Right, so
Just a quick follow-up. I apologize. So, is that violence directly due to the fact that drugs, this is in Mexico, correct?
right, here, I can explain this point if you're finished asking your question.
Yeah, so this is from, sorry, go ahead.
Okay, so this is from the American Enterprise Institute in 2021, and this part is specifically telling you that the reason why there's been this increase in violence in Mexico is because of the legalization of marijuana. I want to clear up this point in case it becomes like a point of contention, but what we're saying here is that the border states have begun legalizing marijuana, as we both talked about, and the impact of this is that drug cartels that exist in Mexico are seeing less profits from selling marijuana to the U.S., which is what you guys read in case, right? But what we're saying is that this is a problem by the American Enterprise Institute because they are switching to violence. So these cartels switching to violence has led to this increased mafia violence, has led to the 30,000 murders because they see less of a market.
You can go ahead.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so you talked about Oregon at the end of your case. Really quickly, so if Oregon is increasing these treatment centers, what is the impact of this? Has Oregon seen a huge decrease in drug use?
It's, okay, first of all, the only thing they've legalized is marijuana.
Sure. But you said that they're putting money back into rehab facilities. You told me that they're buying these new rehab centers. So what is the point of that then? What is the impact of building these new treatment centers?
It'll help people who are currently in the status quo addicted get off.
Right. Has it helped them?
We can address it later. That's time, yeah.
So is anybody not ready? Alright, awesome. So I will start my time now. So first we're going to look at the contention one, which is about Big Pharma. First, you have to understand that this lobbying that they talk about, the way that Big Pharma influences the medical industry, is actually not happening in the status quo. Right now, Politico in 2022 reports that the marijuana companies are spending less on lobbying as it is not working. Even as cannabis has grown into a multi-billion-dollar industry, there hasn't been a corresponding increase in federal lobbying expenditures. Cannabis companies and industry groups actually spent less on federal lobbying in 2021 than they did in earlier years. The three leading cannabis industry groups spent less than $900,000 combined during the first 3 quarters of last year on lobbying. So this hypothetical world that they talk about, how Big Pharma is going to influence every decision that doctors and consumers make, is not true. Next, we can look at each one of their impacts specifically: advertising, marketing, and off-label marketing. Emma has cards that she will bring up in summary that she tells you that money gained from tax revenue is funneled not only into rehab, but in Colorado, things like education centers. People know that these drugs are bad, and there is absolutely no reason as to why somebody would willingly buy something that is made out of methamphetamine or heroin. There is no link that they can make there. Their link for this entire contention is that all of these strategies, these marketing strategies, these prescribing increases, is that it is going to increase use of these drugs. However, that is actually not what happens empirically. Empirically, policies that align with legalization have shown that use does not increase. Brookings tells us that the decriminalization of cannabis in 11 U.S. states did not participate in a dramatic rise in consumption. We can point to the legal sale of cannabis even through other countries in the Netherlands, which also do not have seen significantly boosted use by the Dutch. Even further, public opinion polls show that most Americans would not rush off to try forbidden drugs the second they became illegal. That's in the United States. We can also look at the teen population. Legalization actually decreases use within the teen population. This is from the International Policy Digest in 2022. Legalization overall decreases use not only in the U.S. in general, but for the teens. Next, we can look internationally. There's no relationship between legalizing and an increase in use. From the New Statesman in 2021, a 2014 report by the UK's Home Office did not find any correlation between drug enforcement and the increase in use. So all of their impacts on that contention are going to fall. Next, they talk briefly about the opioid crisis. This is an argument that you are actually going to turn to the affirmation. First, Myron, the Department of Economics at Harvard and senior fellow at the Cato Institute, tells us that strict regulations in the status quo are what is pushing people to overdose. Restrictions on prescribing push users from prescription opioids and divert them to illicit opioids, which increase the risk of overdose. cannot assess the quality and potency in underground market. Myron goes on to say that restrictions should lessen to the point of legalization. Second, you can delink this argument entirely. The opioid crisis is not the main driver of opioid overdoses. Trends in opioid prescribing have actually recently gone down, and the overdose rate has gone up towards synthetic heroin and synthetic opioids. So this means that prescribing these legal opioids is not the issue, it is actually the illicit market. Next, that leads us straight into my attack on their contention 2, all about cartels. You're going to vote for the pro on this because cartels lose power when drugs are legalized. They concede this by making their point about diversification. We can look at this under the lens of cannabis. Science reports that statistical analysis tells us that there was a direct decrease nationwide of 20% of low-quality illegal cannabis from cartels. They said that there were massive changes in the amount of potency and the number of illicit drugs on the street. The hit in the market ultimately caused cartels to exit the market, resulting in a decrease in supply of other substances. Second, people prefer legal cannabis to illicit cannabis. We see empirically in Colorado from the Cato Institute in 2018, marijuana legally grown in states where it is legalized supplies consumers in states where marijuana is still outlawed. We tell you in case that 44% of Colorado sales alone were to people of other states, meaning that instead of the illicit market, when people have the option, they prefer to buy legal. And the only change that we can see in this round is a ballot and affirmation, and that's where Emma and I stand.
We're going to talk about Ekblaw.
Right, is everyone ready? Are my judges ready? Comments?
Yep.
Okay. Just before I start, this is going to be a little bit of an unorthodox structure. First, I'm going to clear some things up, but because our contentions are so similar, I'm going to talk about their contention 2 on dust and our contention 1 on pharma together. And then I'm going to talk about their contention 1 on safe products and our contention on cartels together. But I will make sure to signpost so that you guys all know where I'm at. Okay, I'm starting my time now. First, to clear up this point about incarceration. Legalization will not solve mass incarceration. Lopez 18 finds that only 3.4% of state prisoners and less than 0.5% of federal prisoners were in jail for drug and marijuana possession. This is super important. It's not a very big issue, or it's not the majority of the issue that they talk about. Also on this point about economy, Recovery Centers of America 16 estimates the cost of drug abuse to be $1.5 trillion. This really goes against what they read about the economic cost of us not affirming. Right now, we see that there's a very big impact to drug abuse, and Marissa and I affirm that we need to lessen that number, of course. But on to their C2 about deaths and our C1 on pharma. I'm first going to respond to their arguments against our contention. They talk about government lobbying. One of our 3 points is not on government lobbying, it's about the lobbying of all doctors, so this isn't super interactive, but our point still stands. Waters 20 did find that pharmaceutical companies spent $233 million per year lobbying the United States federal government. That's from 2020, that's a recent card, and that's a big, very big number. But we also tell you that this number is going to increase when drugs are legalized and big pharma companies have an actual opening in the market. This is very basic knowledge. Right now, lobbying isn't going to do anything because drugs are illegal. They can't lobby for less regulations if there's no opportunity for regulations to exist. But if we affirm, then we're going to see an opportunity for the federal government to regulate, and then pharma companies are going to increase their spending on lobbying so that they can turn a profit. They also don't respond to any of our 3 points specifically. They say that they're going to bring them up in cross, and they try to cross-apply regulation. I'm going to talk about that later. They also talk about the decriminalization of marijuana not leading to use increasing. There are 2 main problems. We're talking about legalization, not decriminalization, and we're talking about not just marijuana, but all drugs. Friedel 17 and Lopez 17, which Marissa read in case, talk about the precedent set by big opioid, alcohol, and tobacco companies. The legalization of drugs would allow the FDA and federal government as a whole to turn a blind eye to corporate financial interests. They say that trends in opioid prescribing are going down. We have direct evidence against this that we read in case in Lost 21, very recent. They lastly say that this won't be as large of an issue because drugs won't be laced. Remember that opioids were legal drugs. They were able to be regulated and they weren't. This is not going to happen. But on regulation, money is not going to be saved. The Centennial Institute 2018 found that for every dollar gained in tax revenue, Coloradans spent approximately $4.5 to mitigate the effects of legalization. This is because of our contention on big pharma. Access will increase if we affirm. We are not going to create a problem just to solve it, but that's what the affirmative wants. Even if you disregard all of the evidence I just read and believe that the government will both be able to and will try to regulate, remember off-label marketing, our subpoint C. This is not going to be touched by regulation in any world. It wasn't touched by regulation in the opioid crisis. By nature, it cannot be touched by regulation. But on to treatment, which is something that they cross-applied to our case and bring up a lot in their contention. And cross, they specifically concede that we don't see treatment in an app world. They concede this not only once, but twice. They first say that even though opioids are legalized, there is no treatment. They say that federal legalization will only be able to help, but this is not true. On Oregon, they tell you about rehab centers, but don't really talk about the impacts. Westerville 21 points out that when Oregon legalized the possession of small amounts of cocaine, heroin, LSD, methamphetamine, there was pushback from the healthcare system because they didn't have the resources to actually do anything about it. But even if the government does try to regulate, apply the reasoning of our big pharma contention. And lastly, even if you don't believe all of this, weigh lives above money. Really quickly, onto the contention one about safe products and our contention two on cartels. Their rebuttals did not at all respond to our exact reasoning and warranting. Marissa and I tell you that use and the market for cartels is initially going to decrease, and this is exactly what is going to let cartels pivot to either selling worse and more harmful drugs, or to mafia violence. Remember this 30,000 card, because they don't interact with our reasoning, this card still stands. This is a very big number of people. That number is just going to increase in an app world. Weigh out some probability, weigh out some severity. I negate. We're going to take 25 seconds of props. Are you ready for props?
Yep.
Okay. I'm going to start my time now. Do you
Right.
have a question?
Yeah, sure. So you said that we didn't respond to your reasoning behind cartels on your contention 2. You said that use decreases, which allows cartels to pivot, correct?
Right, so what we're initially going to see is that we're going to see, not use decrease, I'm sorry if I misspoke, we're going to see the demand for cartel drugs to decrease, right? Because there's obviously increased accessibility because big pharma companies are going to be able to market, they're going to be able to put drugs in stores. And so people are initially going to buy from these big pharma companies, and the profit for cartels is going to decrease. But our Dickinson evidence is very specific. It says that it's built into the business models of these cartels that when this happens, when their profits initially decrease, they pivot to either selling more potent drugs, which there will be a market for in an app world, because big pharma companies are going to have very high profits, and people are going to want to get very high potent drugs at a low cost, which is what cartels provide. But also because the other option is that cartels, again, either make drugs more potent or they pivot to mafia violence. And this is what we saw in Mexico. Our card specifically links the legalization of marijuana to the death of 30,000 people. Because what happened is cartels had less of a profit, and then they started attacking small businesses in order to get money. This happened, this is a very, very important card.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah.
So when saying that cartels diversify, do you concede the fact that in legalizing, we're taking funding away from the cartels?
Yeah, that's exactly, so I'm really actually glad you brought that up. There's less of a demand for cartel drugs at the beginning because there's increased accessibility to stores, and that's because of big pharma. But it's worked into the cartel's business model that they have money saved to pivot to opioid use. And then also, if they run out of that money again, they pivot to mafia violence.
Yeah,
the other really important point is that this is interconnected. Our contention one on big pharma, what's initially going to happen in an app world is that big pharma is going to market to people. They're going to get people addicted.
Okay, right. I think you're just repeating a lot of your case right now.
No, I'm actually making a new point, right? I can ask a question.
Yeah, please ask a question.
Okay, so you bring up this point about incarceration, and then you also bring up this point about treatment. If in an app world, if we don't have people in prison who are doing drugs, how are we going to treat those people? How do we know that they're doing drugs? How are we going to mandate that they go to treatment?
Okay, so you're asking that, can you rephrase just a little bit?
Okay, so in an affirmative world, we don't have people in prison who are doing drugs. We have no way to track people who are doing drugs. We have no way to mandate treatment for them. So how
You
would we
can
ensure
definitely
people get
mandate
treatment?
treatment.
How? How do you find those people and tell them that they have to get treated if drugs aren't legalized in the first place? If there's no resources dedicating
Well, just
to
because
figuring
drugs
out
are
how to sell
legalized,
drugs.
one, doesn't mean people don't use them, and two, doesn't mean people get, incarcerated for those things, leading to mandated treatment.
Sorry, can you repeat that?
So, okay. So one, just because a drug is illegal doesn't mean that people, one, don't use them, and two, don't get caught using them.
Right now they get
Therefore,
caught
mandated
using them
treatment.
and go into prison. We actually have drug courts, which are super, sorry, that's fine.
Alright. Ready? Comments? Sit. That's it. And begin. Now, keep in mind that overdose deaths are only increasing every year. Millions are dying because the cartels have a strong hold and the only hold on the market on drugs. If you are leaning in a con ballot thus far and are voting for the continuation of this trend, you are voting to continue those lives being lost. However, in the pro, we can save all of these lives. And this is how we're going to win. First, on cartels and opioids, and basically I'm going to mix these together. So first, as I've said, cartels are creating dangerous, laced, lethal drugs, which is why people are ODing. We can tie this in with the opioid point that my opponents bring up. As Sidney explained in her rebuttal, the opioid crisis was driven by these laced drugs. Those 500,000 deaths since 1999 were not due to prescribed opioids. The majority of those deaths were because of prohibition, as we've stated. So we are not going to have an opioid crisis 2.0 because once you drive out those cartels, overdose deaths significantly decrease. Thus, this should flow to the pro. Secondly, we can see with the cartels that people want legal. They don't want illegal. Right now, they have one option, illicit substances. But as we've seen empirically in Colorado, 44% of their sales went to residents of other states. People are preferring this even when they have the option of cartels, no matter the price. So even if prices say in Colorado were maybe $1 or more expensive, they're still deciding to pick that because they know for a fact that the drugs they're getting from the illicit market have the potential to kill them with the first hit. So turn that and flow it to our side as well. Thirdly, the opposition says that money is saved and it works into the cartel's business plan. But this cannot stand if we are proving to you thus far that cartels are being mitigated and pushed out of the U.S. When you get rid of the market that they have, that saved money that my opponents claim is so much, which we don't even know the number, is going to run out eventually. So even in the long term, we are continuing to mitigate these cartels substantially. Fourthly, on diversification, this just proves that we are pushing cartels out of the market further. Yes, I understand that these other areas are sensitive and they're dangerous as well. However, I acknowledge the fact that, and my opponents should as well, that drugs are one of the #1 income for the cartel. We are taking away their biggest market and pushing them into these other areas that can also be assessed by the decreased drug enforcement spending. So now, all that time that we're spending on drug enforcement could be pushed to those other areas to focus on. Lastly, rehabilitation, which is the second biggest point in this round. The opposition tries to claim that we don't say rehab exists in an affirmation world, but that is just simply wrong. To clarify, we all agree that in the status quo, rehab is ineffective. According to Promises and Behavior in 2021, the main two reasons why people don't go to rehab is because of the stigma and because it is ineffective. If we change that stigma and increase our resources with tax revenue and decrease drug enforcement spending, those programs are going to be more attractive to those people who want that help. Thus, I can only see a vote in affirmation. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to take the rest of our vote. Just before I start, I'm going to do just voting issues and then weighing at the bottom. It's pretty standard. Is everyone ready? Okay, I'm going to start my 3 minutes now. So firstly, a huge voting issue here is treatment and regulation. They bring this up in their summary and we agree that this is a huge voting issue. They have created this huge link chain in this round. First, they have to prove that legalization will increase tax revenues. Then they have to prove that basically federally we will set up separate laws that will mandate that these tax revenues go into treatment. And then we also have to prove that people actually go to these centers. Remember that earlier in First Cross, I asked them what the impact of Oregon increasing recovery centers would be, but they can't provide any way that these treatment centers have helped for the exact reasons that they tell you in their rebuttal to our case, which is that treatment is ineffective. If they believe that treatment services right now are ineffective, what reason do we have to believe that in an AF world they would suddenly be better, that these treatment centers would suddenly be effective? This is just simply not true. But once again, they don't even prove that this tax revenue will go into treatment, so we can't buy them on that either. On stigma, they say that stigma stops people from doing drugs, but in an AF world, there is still stigma to getting treatment. So remember, this is like another thing that they have to prove for treatment. On Big Pharma and regulation, huge voting issue here. They try to prove that regulations and government action will remove Big Pharma's threat, but this won't happen for several reasons. Lamas 21 tells us that the government will not regulate Big Pharma companies because they're not doing so in the status quo. Kate tells you this in rebuttal. Also, regulation and fines will not affect Big Pharma because they have such a huge market and there's too much money to be made that they can just pay off these fines that they have. Also, Big Pharma finds loopholes like off-label medication, which I read you as early as case that they still haven't responded to. This is a legalized drug that is used for illegal purposes. They only respond with government government lobbying, which Kate tells you is still increasing, but don't let them just use this a general government lobbying response on the entire thing. Also, they read that this has no impact on people because people can make better choices, but this is not true. In case I tell you that 2/3 of people take action, like asking their doctor to prescribe a medication after seeing a drug ad, this has an impact on people. But hugely, all of these arguments are interconnected. Big Pharma will take over the market in an app world, and accessibility will increase, which turns into a big profit. They will rise prices, and people will desire higher potency drugs, so they will turn back to drug cartels. Even if you believe that regulation will occur and that it will make legal drugs less potent, which is what they respond with, we still see high rates of addiction. Remember what Kate tells you, that the opioid crisis happened with legalized drugs. Opioids were made by professionals. And so this impact is mitigated because it still costs 500,000 deaths. Remember Derek and Farrell 13, that, again, this is on the legal opioids, and despite that, but moving on to cartels, another huge voting issue. They say that they lose power, but what they're really saying here is that they're losing money in the status quo, which is exactly our point, is that they're losing this marijuana market and they're pivoting to violence. These high overdose rates are not entirely due to cartels, they're due to big pharma marketing to people. Hugely here, we outweigh on probability because there's no probability that people will even be treated if they're increasing addiction because of big pharma. Also on severity, they read these numbers about people being addicted to drugs, but don't tell you how they solve for it. We tell you how we solve for these thousands of lives being lost. America. All right, throw the bed over. Ready for class?
This is a big point, obviously, but why would you keep the market in the hands of the cartels in your world? How would that be better than giving the market to government regulation?
Right, so what we're saying here is that currently in the status quo, without the legalization of all drugs, it is hugely essential that we keep drug cartels right where they are. Because while we agree that drug cartels are bad, what we're saying is that they're going to get so much worse if we remove this market for marijuana, which is exactly what we're seeing manifest with increased marijuana legalization right now. This is a hugely important point because, I mean, you're saying that their funds will go down so they'll just disappear, but this is not what we're seeing occur right now. The American
I'm sorry, I understand what you're saying. You didn't answer my question. I'm sorry, I don't want to interrupt you.
No,
I just want to make sure we get to this. What's your question? You haven't answered my question on how would that be better than a regulated market?
Right. Regulation isn't going to happen. In order to prove that regulation is going to happen, you have to say that the government wants to regulate at financial detriment to themselves, and that these regulations would be effective, and that they would regulate things like off-label marketing, which you never establish, or like you said.
Right.
Why is everything that's legal? Why is
doesn't mean that regulation will just follow for drug cartels when it's not happening right now.
Right, okay, but why then is alcohol, tobacco, anything that is legalized in the world, why is that regulated? Why wouldn't the government want to regulate something as dangerous as this?
It's because there's a difference between things like alcohol and tobacco, which are much less addictive than things like heroin and opioids. Big Pharma has a unique market to be able to get people addicted to drugs like opioids and then make money off of them in a very a long term.
You got a question?
Right, sure. So you're talking about how kind of the government is taking action against big pharma and stuff like that. Can you give me an example of something that the government has done besides lobbying, against lobbying? Do you have any example of how the government is incentivized to decrease?
Well, our point was about lobbying, so.
Right.
You had 3 points that were specifically not about lobbying that you never
Can I
responded
finish?
to. Yeah, of course.
Our point was about lobbying. I think it would be completely off topic for me to give you something besides lobbying because that's not what we're arguing about. And at this point, we can't bring up anything new and speak.
Okay, right. But I'm not arguing new things. I'm just saying how is the government incentivized to decrease big pharma beyond government lobbying, which is never what we said in case.
Okay, so how is the government incentivized to decrease big pharma? I believe that right now, anyone can see, even the government, that the status quo is not working in any metric whatsoever. The cartel has a complete monopoly on the drug market, and anyone who can even start to fix that has an incentive to do so. Because one, we tell you in case that you get a $106.7 billion increase in the tax revenue, that can be allocated to even fighting diversification, education.
Is it going to be allocated to that? What reason
It is.
it's going on?
Okay, as we've run a case, Oregon has put $470 million between 2017
Right, but for every
and
dollar that's gained by tax revenue, $4 is
And we're going to use, it should be about 1 minute and 10 left of prep time. I'll start there. All right. Is there anybody that's not ready? No. All right, awesome. So I will start my time now. I'm going to have 3 main voting issues just for your vote. All right, so we're going to start off with rehabilitation. Remember, $106.7 billion solely unique to legalization is projected to be gained from tax revenue on illicit drugs. We tell you that that's linked to 12 new treatment centers in places like Oregon and hundreds of millions of dollars thrown directly back into rehab and education programs. Let me remind you that if you're voting for con, you're voting for the status quo. You are voting for the continuation of mass incarceration, the continuation of overdose deaths increasing every single year. Even if you believe every single one of their arguments, the AF is trying and the con is kicking them to the curb. Next, let's look on about the opioid crisis. Remember when I tell you this is going uncontested, that the majority of overdose deaths are due to the black market. My opponents say that prescription caused the entire epidemic. However, remember in my rebuttal when I tell you that prescription has decreased as of 2019 and overdose deaths have still increased. This proves that the illicit market, the cartel, is the problem. My opponents even concede that the cartel will be gone away due to the lack of funding and the lack of a market in the United States. So that point, the opioid crisis flows to the affirmation. Next, we're going to look at the biggest point in this entire round, which is going to be cartels. My opponents conceded crossfire that we hurt cartels by taking away their funding, taking away their market. Their only response is by saying that they diversify, which again, concedes that market. Right now, cartels have a monopoly on the illicit drug market. We're never going to reduce the demand for drugs. The only thing that we can do is make them safer. If the cartel have a monopoly where 55, 56%, 44% of people are dying from laced drugs of heroin and methamphetamine respectively, people are not safe. We have to take away this monopoly by allowing regulation on drugs that are made in the United States. Remember, the only thing that we can do under the scope of this resolution, the only action we can take is getting the cartels out of the drug market. The affirmative is the only side that can change the status quo. If you're voting for my opponents, you're voting for the war on drugs. Okay, is everyone ready? Okay, I'm just going to go voting issues and then Okay, I'm starting my time now. Okay, first on pharma regulation and treatment. They've created a very big link chain. Remember that they have to prove that first, legalization will increase tax revenues. Then the government will set up separate laws that go into treatment. And then they will have to prove that people actually go to these centers. But we specifically tell you on Pharma, we provide you 3 different subpoints that they never respond to individually on advertising, on marketing to doctors, and on off-label marketing. Of these, our third contention on off-label marketing, by definition, it cannot be helped by regulation. Even if you believe everything they say, we still have that point because they never talked about it. On to cartels, our second voting issue. They never interact with our reasoning. Don't let them keep repeating this point about people preferring legal means of consumption, and repeating this just sentence that is not backed up by evidence that we can get rid of cartels in an app world, because this doesn't interact with our reasoning that we've explained many, many times. Cartels are not just going to give up. In fact, Dickinson says that it's built into their business model, that if we legalize marijuana, and what happened when we legalized marijuana is that they didn't just give up, they didn't just accept a loss of profit, they instead sold more potent drugs, and they also pivoted to mafia violence. This leads directly, legalization is directly leads to our 30,000 card on weighing. Prefer us because we give you very specific, quantifiable ways that app will lead to more violence and death. They read economic impacts about people being addicted and not even helped in app. But even if treatment works, people will still become addicted to drugs because of big pharma before they can seek treatment. Again, on probability, they have to prove that legalization will do all of these things to access treatment. They have to prove that the government would both want to regulate at financial detriment to themselves, and that these would be effective for regulation. On big pharma, remember we have very specific historical precedents. On cartels, again, this 30,000 card, this is another historical example. On severity, this 30,000 deaths due to cartel violence, 500,000 due to the opioid crisis. Both of these numbers would increase. We provide you very specific evidence. That they say that we kick people to the curb instead of helping them. If the affirmative creates problems just to solve them and then can't actually solve them. Thank you.